Hi, I'm Terry Arnold, and welcome to join us for our podcast. It's called TalkIBC, and I have with me today is Dr. Naoto Ueno. Dr. Ueno is the Executive Director of the Morgan Welch Clinic for Inflammatory Breast Cancer at MD Anderson. Hello, sir.
Hi, thank you, Terry, for inviting me to this wonderful opportunity.
Well, I've been looking forward to doing podcasts for a while. I know we've talked about it for a while, but under the pandemic, we felt everyone was very stretched. So I'm very grateful that you're giving us this time. And I know we have a few outlines of things we want to talk about. So just for listeners to know, we're going to be talking about the Morgan Welch Clinic. We're going to be talking about Dr. Ueno's experience as a clinician, as probably as well as a cancer survivor himself, and then also research. We're going to be talking about ways to be more engaged in what is going on in the future in the landscape of inflammatory breast cancer. So would you like to tell them a little bit about the clinic to start? This is very informal. You're in my living room. I'm kind of in your living room because I feel like you live at MD Anderson. You spend a lot of time there.
I do.
You do. What would you like people to know about the Morgan Welch Clinic at MD Anderson in Houston, Texas?
So we are one of the first inflammatory breast cancer specialized clinic in the world. It has a history of more than 10 years. And it's a clinic really inspired by those people who are struggling from inflammatory breast cancer, starting with Morgan Welch. She was a IBC patient, but not only that, collectively, there are many patients, patient advocates, caregivers that we thought that there's really a need for a clinic that tackles inflammatory breast cancer, given that this disease is rare and aggressive. And those people reached out, working with Dr. Cristofanelli, Dr. Buckles, went to the state of New Mexico and state of Texas. And we were very fortunate that both states has decided to support for creating a specialized clinic. So what does this mean? Well, it means that we have a dedicated team of clinicians, researcher, administrator, who's very passionate about somehow we need to do something about this disease so that we could reduce the suffering of many of these patients. So over the 10 years, we have, if you come to MD Anderson, you not only see a breast cancer specialist, but breast cancer specialists who are truly interested, or not just interested, but really experienced with taking care of IBC. And that is what we call the IBC clinic.
I think that's really interesting because, you know, if you've spent any time learning about inflammatory breast cancer, we know this disease has been written about since the 1800s under Charles Bell. But the fact that it doesn't have medical coding and it doesn't have a lot of separate education about it, to see a dedicated clinic that started in 2006 is kind of remarkable. Mm-hmm. And so kudos to those advocates in the state of Texas and New Mexico for collectively making that happen. That infrastructure, what does that mean? Because when someone says, well, I'm seeing someone who's a specialist in IBC, how would you make them understand that what a trimodal clinic means? And even though that doctor may have a lot of experience and not slouching against that, what is different about a trimodal clinic versus maybe someone locally who's had good experience with IBC?
Right. So I think that's a good question because inflammatory breast cancer itself, as you said, it's been recognized for more than 100 years. And so that's nothing special, right? And then not only that, at the national level, there is a standard care that's established. But this standard care has been really developed from regular breast cancer. And there's a subtle difference in terms of how much we should really coordinate our care between the surgeon, radiation oncologist, medical oncologist, pathologist, and imaging people. So what's really, the difference is that given that this disease is very difficult to diagnose, and it has a tendency to spread to other locations real fast. So how do you really coordinate the care and really implement the standard care so that it's not just implementation, but really providing this fine detailed tuning that will give the best outcome? That really comes from IBC specialist. So
I'm going to interrupt real quick. You just said something. I'm looking down, making notes as you talk. You said the standard of care came out of regular breast cancer. Obviously,
Mhm.
regular breast cancer is a big deal and it's a great concern. But when you made a very important point that the standard that we typically think of breast cancer isn't really applicable to IBC, right? Or did I understand that
Well,
correctly?
I think the fundamental part, it is the same, but
Fundamentally. And so can you find what that means by fundamentally the same and versus, and
but
then
I
where it
think
gets different?
each individual have a little bit difference in terms of how things are presenting. For example, the rate of the brain metastasis is high. So when do we actually obtain MRI? Um, what extent are you actually applying surgical technique? What type of radiation we should be giving? How
Mm-hmm.
much of a type of what type of chemotherapy given? Everything is actually, noted in the standard care of regular breast cancer. But we know that there's a data that if you look at the national data, that there are some people who misses something or they didn't do enough to really push the envelope so that we could get the best outcome. And there's data to suggest that if any of the tri-modality is not given in a timely manner, it will have an impact in survival. So,
Okay.
so it's like the best example I'll give you, anybody could treat leukemia, right? So, and we know how to treat leukemia. We have the textbook, but that doesn't mean that you want to treat leukemia um, with any places. You come to really usually to a large cancer center, and you work with people who are specialized in leukemia, and you could work with that leukemia physician. So
Mm-hmm.
yes, inflammatory breast cancer, I agree that anybody could treat it technically. I mean, there's nothing special about it. But I think really to get the best outcome, it is important to work with IBC specialists. And I would be really like to be careful what I'm saying, that I don't, I'm not asking everybody should come to MD Anderson, but I think it's really important to make sure that you work with a specialist and community physician or whoever's providing, they work with a specialist and not just MD Anderson, but Dana-Farber or those people who are really into this disease could really give you a little bit more guidance and fine tune so that you could get the best outcome.
In a minute, I'd like you to define trimodal, but also I want you to talk about what happens when a patient, I try to always encourage people, if possible, to, you have good local care, but also try to build a relationship with MD Anderson as well, because it's going to help research. Because when you talk about that data, you are doing research that other places aren't doing necessarily. Now, I know they're MD Anderson is the only place, like you mentioned, Dana-Farber, there are others. But so I'd like you to find primordial care, and also when a patient does come to a high volume center, what does that do for research?
Well, it helps to understand the disease. It helps us to finish the clinical trials, which means that we will make advancement in treatments. So one of the challenge of IBC, as we talked about, is making the diagnosis right and implementing the best standard care. And despite of making the right diagnosis, implementing a standard care, we still have a very high rate of disease coming back, and disease coming back could be detrimental in the long-term outcome. So how do we improve this? Well, we have to improve our standard care and we have to conduct clinical trials. And when we talk about clinical trials not simply about treating somebody, but sometimes we have to collect data. And these data could be simply your history or data coming from your samples, such as blood or tissues. And we do analysis, trying to understand what's causing this aggressiveness. And by understanding, it helps. So high volume center is not simply about helping you, and but in addition, it helps the future patient, or even sometimes it helps you because we could get the result faster. If nobody comes to a high volume center, if we don't conduct research, we will not make a progress. So you have to understand that every single treatment that you are receiving is because your predecessor, your patients in the past has contributed to research. So
I heard it referred to as standing on the shoulders of giants, that, you're getting an advantage of something else,
right.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm bad about that. So you have to forgive me. I get excited and you get excited, but clinical trials, you mentioned clinical trials. People are afraid of clinical trials. And I think until they don't realize that there's different phases of clinical trials, and it'd be good if you explain that. And you can't get clinical trials just everywhere, and they're based out of research. But also I think they're afraid of them, but also as a cancer survivor yourself, you've been very open about your experience. I would like you to address the fact that sometimes people are afraid of them, or they think of it as always an end of life choice, that they're out of choices. And sometimes people start clinical trials early into their time. And I think that's something worth talking about.
Yeah. So treatment-related clinical trial is not for people who are towards the end of your treatment or towards the end of your story of your cancer. Because anybody who's facing really imminent death, they really generally are weak and not strong enough. Clinical trials is for people who are generally reasonably healthy. So it is not a last ditch approach. That's one thing people have to remember. And so but there are many different type of trials that you talked about. It's called like phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And phase 1 is a new drug, and it's really tried to validate the toxicity. Phase 2, they look for how well it works. And phase 3, they compare to existing treatment, and they try to compare that it's much better or it's equivalent. So it sounds like phase 1 or phase 2, which is mostly the type of the treatment we see in inflammatory breast cancer, it looks like immature, but the answer is it's not, because many of the trials are designed in a way that we're very careful so that it doesn't harm the patient. Now, yes, I agree that it is experimental treatment. We have no idea that whether we could guarantee the outcome. We don't know. But we also know the standard care well enough that we don't want to risk anybody. So there is a very careful process that we spend so that we don't harm our patients. So the question is, how, personally, do I strongly believe in clinical trials? The answer is I strongly believe. I myself has undergone phase 1 clinical trial in what we call myelodysplastic syndrome, which is a pre-leukemic conditions. And I decided to do a phase 1. We have no idea the drug is going to work, but I wasn't really ready to do the other treatment. And I had toxicity and it didn't work, but it was the best choice. And of course it didn't work. So I ended up getting a transplant. And even that transplant, there was some experimental component to it. So it's...
And that's been successful.
That's been successful.
That's been successful.
Right. So
I want to ask you a question real quick. When you say toxicity, to me, as a layperson, I always think poison. But now I realize that toxicity might mean just bad effect, like it might be significant diarrhea, right? Is that a fair assessment?
Right. It's a fair assessment. And you have to remember that even the standard care has a lot of side effects. Clinical trial has side effects. I think it's a matter of what kind of side effects you're going to see with what chances. There are no treatment. Unfortunately, in cancer treatment, there is no treatment which has zero side effects. So
toxicity is about a measure of side effects,
right?
Not
correct.
a measure of poison.
No, it's not. It's not.
Right.
I mean,
I know. But as a layperson,
it's like any treatment you take, and something that you don't want could happen. And of course, nobody wants it. And I think it's a matter of the side effect. Is it a permanent damage, or by stopping it, does it reverses it? So this, you do need to do a catch ball with your physicians or research coordinator to find out what are the side effects we're talking about. Because if you're gonna, if I was a patient and then I'm gonna give you this treatment, but the side effect is gonna have a permanent damage to my lung, I may hesitate doing that kind of treatment, right? But if the side effect is really mild damage to the liver, by stopping it, it reverses it, okay? Then it has a different meaning. So you don't want to, I'm not going to say that you have to do clinical trials, but I tell my patient, at least you should really talk with them and try to see that whether it's for me or not. So the way sometimes I talk to my patient is that participating in clinical trial is like trying to understand your how much risk you could take for doing investment in stock.
Right.
And some people says, well, I'm not going to take any risk to invest because I don't want to lose money, right? Or like gambling, right? Well, some people say that I really want to, I could take that risk type of thing. And so we don't have one person who, everybody has a different approaches. So I had to really spend time to not just talking about side effects and outcome, but what is this person's, in terms of pyramid, kind of a capacity to handle the risk. Because if you have a person who have no capacity to handle the risk, and this has nothing to do about good or bad, it's hard to really talk about clinical trials because there's a risk involved. But that's even when you have a person who cannot take a risk, even standard care becomes difficult because even standard care has side effects. So
right. Well, it's interesting to me because I kind of grew up thinking clinical trials were experiment. I get that they are not necessarily, finalized treatment. But I didn't realize so many things like they aren't allowed to give you less than standard, that you can't go backwards. And then, today's clinical trial might be next year's treatment. So that's kind of cool. And I also learned how much you're monitored under clinical trials very closely to watch for anything. You're monitored much more closely. So that's an interesting thing to make me. I've never been able to take a clinical trial. I was diagnosed with inflammatory breast cancer in 2007, and I've been very fortunate that everything in my treatment pool worked. And I have tried to be in clinical trials of advanced research, but I was never a right candidate. So, but I learned a lot when I was trying to look into how I could help science.
Yeah, so Terry, I think that's a really interesting point because there are data. I'm not talking about inflammatory breast cancer clinical trials, but there are data that clinical trials, side effects, and negative impact is not really that worse than you think, actually, because of careful planning, careful monitoring. Yes, there's always extreme outcome. However, in most cases, patients are in reasonable safety margin.
That's what I've heard, and I felt much better knowing that because I didn't know these things. So, we talked a little bit about, just the development of the clinic and how, and I think it's good to hear you say that not everybody has to come to MD Anderson. But I think it's also good to hear that what can happen if you are at a trimodal place like MD Anderson, and we never really defined trimodal care yet, and we need to do that. But like, what advantages are there in that you could team tackle with your local doctors and also a trimodal place to help science and then get the best possible care. But do you want to define trimodal real quickly before we move on to other questions?
Right. Trimodal is basically the medical oncology, surgery, and radiation therapy oncologists working together, because the standard care for newly diagnosed inflammatory breast cancer is to give you some form of what we call systemic therapy, which include chemotherapy, shrink the tumor as much as possible, and then go for surgery and remove the breast and the lymph node, followed by consolidating with a radiation therapy. And so because there's 3 different major modalities involved, it is called the trimodality.
And see, I think that's really important because one of the concerns I have about seeing people away from a high volume clinic like MD Anderson or Dana-Farber is that sometimes the surgeon will say, wow, you had this great response to chemotherapy and you've got clean margins in your surgery, so let's skip radiation. And that always makes me nervous because there's a reason that radiation is viewed as necessary. And I hear a lot from smaller town, and I'm not trying to throw a rock at smaller towns. I've seen it at big cities too, where they'll say, well, let's save that radiation for later. Or since you had such a great response to chemotherapy, let's do a less invasive breast surgery. And there is strong reason why that tri-modality is important. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because since IBC behaves so differently, I think that's things people really need to know.
So as you just said, that the National Breast Cancer Database suggests that 20 to 30% of the practice in the US is missing one of those three modalities.
20 to 30%. That's scary.
It is scary.
It's
and then
scary.
we have data that when you miss one of those modalities, the survival is less comparing to those who receive three treatment. So this is really a big problem.
And the deal is about when you miss that modality, is IBC behaves so quickly. It's cancer is typically slow. IBC is not. Can you just discuss that, the comparison of?
Well, so we don't know the details, but this is a survival data. So we speculate that any of those people who died from this disease is that by missing one of the modality, the disease will come back and spread and result in a fatal situation.
Right. And so since it does present at such late stage, and then it has a reoccurrence rate of being quick, if it should come back, even in the best case scenario, I can see how losing. And when you hear 30 to 30%, that's shocking, but rare diseases aren't taught. So how are we getting around that? I think what's happening at the San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium, there's a lot of information there shared through posters, but IBC is not presented from the main stage. So can you tell me how, as a leading world researcher and clinician, you combat that through maybe the international consortium, or what other educational efforts are being done to help bring everyone up to speed?
So I think there's a general effort from not just San Antonio, but ASCO that IBC is a rare disease and aggressive. And I think in some way we've been very successful, of more people are concerned about it. And one of the successes that people start recognizing that there are specialized clinic in the United States, like MD Anderson and Dana-Farber and Duke. And so I think in that way, it's really very successful. But one of the challenge we continue to have is, rather than success, I'm going to talk about challenges that the guideline for treatment for NCC, guideline of how we should be treated, is documented like in NCCN, which is a real large organization who standardized the treatment. However, that doesn't mean it's implemented. People have knowledge most of the time. So knowledge doesn't always translate to implementation. So that's a big difference that we face. So it's like the same thing I was talking about. If it's a leukemia, I think people are more going to say, well, I'm not going to treat this because this is a highly specialized area. So I'll send it to I'll work with a specialist, or I'll send to the specialist, right? IBC, most of the attitude for many of the primary physician, they're going to say, well, I know how to treat this, so don't worry about it. You don't have to go to a specialized clinic. So
well, I think they think breast cancer kind of gets lumped under the same umbrella.
Exactly. And then we see this as an issue, and MD Anderson recognized that this is an issue. So therefore, 2 years ago, MD Anderson has decided to divide their treatment algorithm to regular breast cancer and IBC. We used to be under the wing of the regular breast cancer. So if you do a Google search and put MD Anderson treatment algorithm, then that link will show up, and you could find the both how we treat for IBC and how we treat for regular breast cancer. So
I think the algorithm is really important because one of the things I see is a lot of times women will call me and say, my doctor doesn't think I need to have a radical non-skin sparing mastectomy with a nodal sweep, that I've done so well, we're going to do a more breast conserving surgery. And that always makes me shudder because I can't tell them what to do. I'm not their physician. I'm not anybody's physician, I'm not a physician, but I also know the algorithm. I also know that the stats are not in their favor. I think a lot of times misguided good intentions, they're trying to do something that's less permanent, but is putting them at a greater risk. And I think that's where experience matters of being in a high volume clinic.
Mhm. Yeah.
You know, what do you, okay, we mentioned San Antonio only briefly, but in its history, um, IBC kind of tends to be, you know, in the poster sessions and the more small talks, but there is an international consortium that is hosting meetings. What would you like people to know about that? Or the
So
meeting
I,
you're having this
I think
December in Houston, part of
yeah.
that.
So this international consortium has a history of over probably 15 years trying to standardize how to make a diagnosis, and then we're trying to work together so that we could increase awareness and conduct research. So every 2 years we have our international IBC conferences, and the first one was actually hosted in Houston by MD Anderson. And so now the seventh international conference is actually coming to Houston this December. And this conference will talk about the latest development in understanding the disease, what type of new treatment that's coming out. And it's a gathering for the researchers, clinicians, patient advocates, caregivers. And we want to have a collective impact by networking and mingling and exchanging ideas. So we will be posting the details of the conference very soon, hopefully within this 1 month. So we're looking for everybody's participation.
Well, the IBC Network is a sponsor of the International Symposium. Again, we sponsor a lot of things at MD Anderson. We sponsor research as well as your CMEs and your different medical educational meetings. I'd love to you to tell people about some of your new research that's coming out. You've got some pretty ambitious goals. And also I'd like them to hear about some of the research that has been funded with us in particular, or anybody else you're talking about, how that's gone forward. Because I'm seeing some great things happen, but it costs a lot of money. I love it. You call me and you go, can I have some money? I go, yeah, I'll try. You know, I think it's awesome.
I think you guys has been tremendous help to really accelerate the process of research. And as you just said, you're right. Everything is very expensive to conduct a study. And for example, for one clinical trial per patient cost, it could be in the range of $30,000 to $40,000 per patient, right? So, and then if you have a 30 to 40 patient, you could see that the cost could exceed $1 million easily with other additional costs. And even for basic research, we're talking about really to make an impact, we're talking about close to $1 million. Now the thing is that how can you get that such a money? And those money needs to come from like NIH, the federal government, or the state government, or it has to come from the pharmaceutical industry. And the challenge here is that when you have these new ideas, they're not just going to give us money, right? I mean, it's a trust, a mutual relationship between these grant agency. And so what you guys are doing is really giving us sufficient, what we call the seed money or acceleration.
So like we
that
give you 100,000 or 200,000, that's seed money.
and those are tremendous. And sometimes if we this actually is a trigger, and many of our research that you have given us has resulted in getting more money from the other grant agency. If we didn't have it, the first step never happens. The other is we want to conduct a unique clinical trials, and we could get the drug from pharma, but they don't have enough they're not willing to support to really pay for the actual conducting the study. And this is where you guys have been helping us to get us the money so that we could complete the study while we do get support from pharma. So it's a really this collaborative relationship that really makes a difference. And you guys are really making the first step to happen. So we truly appreciate what you're doing.
Well, I know the IBC network has been very happy to offer that seed money, and we hope to get to another level. And I know we also write a lot of letters to support, when you go forward for grants from the Department of Defense or the National Cancer Institute or whatever to help that grow. But what is some research that you want? Because I know it must be an incredible challenge, because from my research of how little funding goes to rare diseases. So, and I get it. If the Department of Defense or the government is going to want to give money for research, they want to get the most bang for their buck. And so they're not going to get a big bang for their buck when you call patient volume with a rare disease, So that seed money for us is more important. But also, I want to get to where the IBC network is also funding at a higher level. And you've got some particular challenges right now where you've asked for like $600,000 for something. Do you want to talk about that? Just put you on the spot and say, is there a different one you want to
I
talk
think
about?
what you're talking about is that many of the things that you have supported really help us to understand the biology of this inflammatory breast cancer. And just to give you some background of what we're talking about here is that there's this what we call genomic medicine, and there's been a lot of interest about genetically they're very different disease. In IBC present very differently comparing to non-IBC. So the premise or our thinking is easily that there's some kind of genetically difference between the two disease. And over the decade, we really couldn't find a dramatic difference genetically between the two cancer. It looks exactly pretty much the same. There's subtle difference, but the same. But then where is the difference? Why is it so aggressive? Why does it present, one looks redder and the other doesn't have any rash? Well, it seems like it's coming from the surrounding of the cancer. And then surrounding the cancer doesn't just exist as a mass, but the normal cells and immune cells. And there are things that architecturally that surrounds the cancers. So there's this environment that's really harnessing how the cancer should be behaving. And that's called, technically, we call it tumor microenvironment. So we see, so some of your research has, help us to dissect, what's the surrounding environment that's making the cancer cells to be aggressive. And we identified targets actually. And so now we're at the stage of getting these drugs that could target the surrounding of the cancer. At the same time, we give direct cancer treatment, but we want to combine those two and then really trying to make a difference. So the challenge is that these drugs are very expensive. The company may give it to us, but to conduct the research, it's been very challenging to get the money from the federal or the pharma. So this is where I'm always calling you to help us to, fund us.
Well, that's okay. And that's the IBC, that's the whole reason the IBC network was formed. I mean, we're a little bit different than other charities. A lot of the pink charities do things to, and, maybe help women diet, exercise, do makeup, or, maybe help pay their hotel bills or those, and all those things are very important. But we felt like where we could help the most in the long run is to help with research. Right. And then that is where we want to be now. And when you mentioned unique challenges, you also, just to get the research trials populated when you have a rare disease is another challenge. So you've got challenge after challenge. That's one reason you're my hero, is you just keep slugging in there.
Right. But I think that, our program has really, I think one of the things I'm very proud of as being an executive director that, I may not have really, give you that right answer the patient wants, but we have created a lot of great infrastructure that allows us to collaborate with other institutions. And so the reason I want to talk about this is it's rare, right? So one thing I learned over a decade is rareness MD Anderson is a big place. However, even MD with the size of MD Anderson alone cannot do it. So then you talk about like international consortium, working with other institutions. So everybody talks about we need to work together. But I think I also learned over this decade that working with other institution, it's not about that, there's a commitment. Everybody wants to do that. But then there's a infrastructure, legality, and then database and integration of multiple different regulation type of thing. So I would like to say that, like, working with like Dana-Farber, we've been spending a lot of time of a lot of boring stuff, like data integration, or trying to see that whether we could open the same trial at two different locations for rare disease. And we're really are coming to a point that that possibility may happen. And I think Dr. Woodward and Dr. Philippa Lins, they have, got to receive a grant together to really trying to define the diagnostic criteria for the IBC. So I see very promising, long-term outcome because of all these infrastructure and administrative things that we were doing. And so I think there's going to be a dramatic change that will continue to come. And I think there are going to be other people who I should be passing the baton and really making a difference is what I hope for. Because one of my goal is, as executive director, is it's ambitious, but I want to make sure the care that we provide does not only exist at MD Anderson. So regardless of the location, the same quality of the value of the care could be provided. That is a very important topic. And it's easy. The concept is easy, but implementation is very difficult. So
well, I've seen the changes that you're talking about, and in my almost 13 years of being involved in inflammatory breast cancer world, the cooperation is huge. And I know when we named our charity, we named it IBC Network Foundation. In some ways that bit us because people think we're a networking company or we're only social media. They don't realize, we're actually a foundation. But we wanted a word that showed action and energy, because we felt like the networking of physicians together, the networking of patients with physicians, the networking of money and pharmaceutical and all those things going together was a multifaceted thing that needed to happen. So I'm really excited to hear you say you think that's going to happen, because I think it's going to happen too. I mean, I've seen that already. I want to ask you a quick question. You mentioned something just today on your Facebook about something with Dr. Rubin's lab and some things that are part of, because like you mentioned, it mentions blood biopsies, and people ask about blood biopsies a lot for IBC. Just like IBC presents differently, some of the tests that we hear people talk about, CTCs, things like that, they don't apply to breast cancer patients well if you have inflammatory. Can you mention that a little bit, since you were so excited about it today?
So I think we're talking about the liquid biopsy, and liquid biopsy, it could collect the cancer cell itself, or it could collect the liquid itself and really leaking out of this genetic material. So I think the technology is very exciting. And I think what people remains the struggle is how do you really apply this in inflammatory breast cancer or breast cancer in general. And I think we do know how to use this when there's a leaking genetic material, that by seeing some genetic changes, we could select a certain cancer treatment. So that's really one excitement we have over the past several years. But that doesn't, it's only a fragment of the cancer cells. So what we, the thing that I posted on Facebook is really collecting the cancer cell itself, and then keep that cancer cells alive, and then really try to holistically understand how the cancer cells behave. And by understanding this, does it really translate to a better treatment? So this is what we call the downstream molecular analysis. And this type of new device could potentially, make a difference. So It's still, one more step needed, but it's a good direction to go.
It is. Well, is there anything about the research that you're doing right now that you want people to know about before we start wrapping up? We've been talking for close to an hour, which I can talk to you all day. I get all excited, and I know your passion is so genuine. But is there anything particular you want people to know about today about your research that you're conducting?
Well, as I said, the biggest thing is this tumor microenvironment, so surrounding of the cancer could be regulated by this target called EGFR. So we have a national federal grant of understanding the biology of EGFR targeting.
Mm-hmm.
And by targeting this, it will make the immunotherapy to work better. So we're going to be studying this more in details in the animal. But at the same time, we have opportunity to conduct a clinical trial to test this as a clinical trial, combining EGFR targeted therapy with the immunotherapy to see that whether immunotherapy will be much better. So we just opened the study, but we don't have a lot of money. And that's where, we're being asking you to see.
That's where you need the bigger money. Now, okay, if I didn't fund it or the IBT never didn't fund it, you can say that. But if I remember correctly, we were some of your bench funders for that research.
That is correct. Yes.
Okay, so the IBC network.
That's the example I was telling you that
Right.
It resulted into getting a R01, and that's close. I think it's more than $1.5 million or something like that we received from the
right now. So we gave you, I think, 100 and almost 200,000, and that turned into that. Tell our audience what an R01 is.
So R01 is really a large sum of money, and the investigator will throw the idea to the federal government, and they said, if this is a great idea, they'll give you more money to study, and that's what it is. And it's really a reflection of getting an R01 shows your, how should I say? I mean, some people in the academic world like us, R01 is a benchmark of showing that you're an independent investigator. So it's probably the highest level of individual grant that you could receive at the national level in the United States. Yeah.
And I think it's very exciting to see that some of the bench research that we have helped fund at the IBC network has led to you getting some bigger grants, and also some of your counterparts. I've seen what Dr. Bizrat Dabib has done, and you've got really shining stars in your clinic. Maggie and Jason. Their research is really doing well.
Right. I think that's a good point, and that's what I mean by passing the baton, which is really identifying the next generation researcher. And you have to kind of look collectively what we need for the IBC community, and it's not about myself, Dr. Woodward, Dr. Lucci, the clinician, but we need the next generation clinician, next generation researcher, next generation administrator, because it's not about us. It's really about how do you keep the torch going on so that you could have a much more larger collective impact. And it is something that we have to really be more aggressive about how to do this, but really to get these next generation, one is funding. I mean, if you don't have funding, of course they have to be smart and really passionate about it, but it gets discouraging when you don't have any resource behind it, right? So
about the funding, this is something I felt silly about. I always assumed that big institutions just had buckets of money that they gave the researchers, to do. I didn't realize if that researcher doesn't get a grant, eventually they don't have a job.
Exactly.
They don't have, I mean, that I thought the hospital gave the researcher the money for something that they wanted to do. I know there's some institutional support, but I didn't realize and so what I could see what would happen is, not to say a researcher's chasing a dollar, but what it is it's a risk to be in a rare disease where there's limited funds.
That is correct. And
it's a huge risk.
Right. So you have to really think from a much more public health perspective, why patient advocacy is really important, why this political action is very important, because you think like NIH and NCI, it has nothing to do with it. Well, it has a lot, because as you just said, nobody is going to jump into the field when there's no resource. People get attracted when there's an investment is made. That's a human nature. And I think that's nothing bad about it. That's how it is. So if you think from the rare disease perspective, there's not sufficient money going in. And if you look in IBC, it's even a smaller pot of money. So if I was a newbie getting into research, which area do I want to go? Well, you're going to go, it's not just simply about passion, but how can I develop my career? Am I going to be able to, have an income so I could keep going on? So IBC itself, for younger investigator, they may get inspired by the mentors, but if you don't meet that right person, it's just a risk. Actually, I would probably do other disease who has a lot more money to it. So this is why it's important for like donation and seed money and really getting the government to say that, oh, we need to really make a difference in rare disease.
Well, that's why I was really pleased that Texas stuck its neck out with the state of New Mexico, because the clinic funded at the Morgan Welch Clinic is actually on a line item budget state of Texas. And what I understand, that is the only clinic at MD Anderson that's funded that way. And from what I understand, it's the only clinic that Texas funds that way. So this is a really unique situation.
Right. And then because state, we have to really get every 2 years and we have to show our progress. So, your support is very important. And if the taxpayer says, oh, there's no need for this, and then, we could get into a very difficult situation. So getting involved in saying that you need this, and this is important to who is representing you is very, very important, actually.
Well, it is. And I tell you that the little bit of money we give you, although in some ways it seems big, but in other ways I know it's tiny, tiny, wouldn't go very far if that infrastructure wasn't there. And so I was really pleased the state of Texas did do that for us. I've kept you a long time, but it's nice to get to just kind of talk to you informally, because I always learn so much and it always encourages me to try to do more. But I always tell people I'm competing on myself. I want people to donate to the IBC Network Foundation, because we can fund things sometimes that is slower for you to get to fund. But also, I always tell people, if they want to donate directly to MD Anderson or Dana-Farber or Duke or someplace else, I'm cool with all that. But so, I need people to know when they donate to IBC Network, that can get money to you that's harder for you to get. But also, they can participate in the boot walk. And one of the things that we want is higher engagement. I know under COVID, it's been difficult for people to be together physically, but I would love to see as many IBC patients at a boot walk as possible, or any kind of thing they do to put a face and a name with those statistical numbers, and also have some stories of hope so people can see people do desire, because we talk about this disease, it's pretty heavily. But what do you want to see about engagement? I know we always wring our hands over the lack of engagement.
Yeah, so I said engagement really comes from really meeting our physicians or researchers or people who support the programs. Boot walk has two aspects, right? So obviously the ultimate ask is really we want you to cough up something to donate, and that would help us to support research. But more than that, I think it's really important to meet who is in this team and then knowing what we're doing. So patient advocacy part is fundamental, part is storytelling. But I think we also are, our job is to tell you our story to you. And so if you don't hear the story, there is no chemistry behind this, right? And I wish that the pandemic is going to be completely over, but I think this is going to be a smoldering situation. So we like people, I don't want you to really think about research or all these things, just to get to know that person. And I think that first step was going to be very important, and Boot Walk provides that platform. So join the team and walk together. And if you feel like, hey, this is an interesting story and I could make a difference, then then think about the donation. And I think one of the personal things that this engagement I see that we still haven't really addressed is I've been talking about this to our online team is the boot walk is really somewhat a little bit focused on MD Anderson too much, and then and considering the rare disease, and it has much more broader impact at the national level. So how can you one of the boot walk meeting that we recently had, the institution celebrates the success of last year boot walk. They were talking about, I think like 18 or 20 countries participate, and this boot walk movement was a much more at the national level. So as the IBC Wrangler, that's the name of our team, how can you engage not people from Texas, but people from other location? But if they end up participating, if they end up donating, what other way can we actually give them an impact? Is it simply investing to MD Anderson? Is that sufficient enough, or is there really a much more broader way of using the network that we created? Because we have what we call IBC Connect, and we have about 12 domestic IBC clinic. So there may be a much more broader way to impact research at the national level. Because when we talk about research is not simply about just doing like a laboratory wet bench research or conducting clinical trials. And there's what we call population science survey, understanding the patient needs. So I think it goes, we want your engagement, but we also need to strategically think about what's the best way to do a better outreach to our community.
Well, and I realized we didn't define boot walk, so I'm going to go and say what it is really quickly. Is MD Anderson instituted something where it allows departments to raise funds. And so the IBC team was formed, and they're called the IBC Wrangler, and there's different departments. I mean, there's one for radiations, there's one particularly for stage 4 breast cancer, there's one for different diseases. And so then that fund can be funneled into a clinic that you get to decide how those money is used. And I know how it's used because I'm actually on the committee that helps select some of that as an advocate, as a former patient or still patient of MD Anderson. And I think it's been very powerful to see that kind of ownership. And I've been very, very proud, and it's driving me crazy that we've never been number one. We were always number two. I want to be number one. And so I think I'm going to just keep at it. But also, one of the things I really am proud to be participating in the IBC Wrangler team is not just the money, is the fact that it's getting the disease name out there. It's making people learn about the disease. And I can tell you from patient engagement, being involved in research, it matters. I went to a San Antonio breast cancer symposium pretty early into my time in advocacy, was totally overwhelmed, walked in, went into a corner, started crying. I thought, why am I here? There's all these people, there's no other advocates. These people are all rock stars, brilliant. What do I have to offer? And I really felt overwhelmed. And the charity was brand new. Would it work? Would anybody care? And I met a researcher who was standing at his poster, and he started explaining all this stuff to me at a really high level. And I'm like, back it down. I'm an advocate. I understand some of this, but you're over my head. He started crying. And I thought, wow, what is this? And he goes, I am a researcher. I don't get to meet patients. And he told me I was pretty much planning on quitting. This is too hard. I know I'm onto something, but this is too hard. I was thinking about transferring into a different field, but I've met you. You're well. I'm going to keep at this. And that meant so much to me to get to actually meet a researcher and thank him and to encourage him to stay in this hard field. I can see how us getting together person to person can really matter to someone. I really do.
No,
So I would love to see a lot of engagement. I would like to find ways to encourage people. We made the IBC Learning Academy, and that was to help train advocates to understand for the unique things you need. Because when you go for a grant, you need a patient advocate on the grant. And now some of these committees are requiring 2 advocates. It's hard enough to find one, let alone 2.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So should we end with patient engagement being involved in the boot walk?
Yeah, I obviously boot walk is one of the great platform for you to casually engage, and every type of engagement is important. And if you say, well, I want to learn more, contact me, contact the program. Happy to set up a meeting and explain what we do, and hopefully we could all collaborate.
Yeah, and people can sign up for the IBC Learning Academy, which is a great way to learn and become engaged, and we can help, network you. That does not necessarily have to just only network you to an MD or certain researcher. We can network you with someplace else. But I think in patient engagement is very important for rare diseases. And so is there any parting message you want to say before we end our podcast today? I know you hate it when I put you on the spot like that. I'm trying to give you the last word.
The last word? I don't know. I mean,
well, then I'm going to end it with my favorite last
I say
word.
The bar will participate in Boot Walk, and if you could donate, that will be always good. Okay, but
well, you are the most accessible.
Like I say, I think the bottom line is, give me an opportunity to tell my story. So that's probably what I'm gonna beg for you.
I think that's great.
That's what we need, and I think give us all the researcher, clinicians, and administrator to speak with you, and I think that's the first step.
I think that's a great thing. And you are incredibly accessible, and you are incredibly generous with your time. And you have a very active personal Facebook page, and you talk science a lot, and you're quite the foodie. I keep wanting to go out to eat with you. We haven't got to do that in a while with the pandemic, so hopefully we can soon. So I'm going to end it with my favorite. And sometimes I admit it is through tears, because this disease can be brutal. But I always tell everyone, hope always. And I say that with all sincerity. Thank you for the time today, sir. I'm looking forward to talking to you again.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.